Welcome, Sally, to Water Underground Talk Season 2. We'll start with a question to kind of get us started. When and how did you start your passion for water?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for inviting me to these talks. Well, as an Australian anthropologist with a background working with Aboriginal people here in Australia, especially in northern Queensland, in native title claims, and I had this kind of interest, a growing interest in the global politics of and struggle for the recognition of Indigenous rights. And I became interested in northern Chile after working in Australia because of the number of Australian mining companies operating in Chile. And I wondered about the two sides of this. First, with Aboriginal friends that I worked with here in Australia were interested in how people elsewhere, Indigenous people elsewhere, were responding to these kinds of conditions, both of the recognition of Indigenous rights and also the operation of mining companies on Indigenous lands and making agreements or not, and so on with mining companies. And so that was one aspect of this interest in working in Chile. And the other was how were Australian mining companies operating in this completely different regulatory jurisdiction, really different to Australia. And so the focus of my research in Chile became this one community, Paine is its name, the village of Paine. And in their territory is located the biggest copper mine in the world called Minera Escondida. And this is operated by a company, a majority Australian company called BHP Billiton. And this mine is in the Atacama Desert, the driest place in the world. And the mining company, Minera Escondida, is extracting over 1,400 litres per second from one aquifer for processing copper. Did I say copper? For processing their copper. And then many more litres per second of water from other aquifers in the area. And useful to note then is that Paine community has 2.3 litres per second of use rights of water for domestic potable water. So these kinds of asymmetries are pretty spectacular. And so there's those asymmetries, but then also when I started working in Paine, and initially I was just interested in this relationship between a global mining company and an Indigenous community and the kind of politics of that relationship, the agreement making they had and so on. And then just everything became about water because it's in the Atacama Desert, because you have these incredible asymmetries in terms of water use. And despite this incredible asymmetry, there was very little kind of conflict. Most people think about mining landscapes as full of kind of conflict, especially between Indigenous people and mining companies. And it was just all very muted. So the water extraction was happening way off scene, like a long way from daily life. And yet there was all of this kind of intensity going on underground, if you like. Also elsewhere. So this to me was just made me completely fascinated, especially with groundwater and all of the questions associated with it.
Cool. Yeah, no, that really leads to my next question, and you've already started talking about it, but what I would be interested to hear in this kind of work, how you see the connections between groundwater and maybe more broadly between anti-racism and decolonization or sustainable development, these kind of big words that we use. Yeah.
I guess groundwater is a particular kind of problem, a bit, in some ways, a bit like climate change, in that you need technology to see it.
Yeah, totally.
It's not immediately, you can see aspects of climate change. We experience different aspects around us. just like we might experience aspects of groundwater through, I don't know, where it pops up in a spring, where
Sure.
it's to the surface, or
Mm-hmm.
these sort of things. But yeah, but you need technology, and technology itself is available in very uneven ways.
Sure. Yeah.
And so this is the point. This is the
Yeah, totally. And that, I mean, the broader theme of this year, UNESCO Year of Groundwater, is making the visible or invisible visible. So that score, yeah, this speaks directly to that. Yeah, I saw little glimpses of you as a person in some of your descriptions there, but I would love to hear a little bit more generally how your personality or some of your personal interests kind of strengthen you as a practitioner and in the field as an anthropologist. Yeah.
Well, I really like people. So
yeah.
So this is good for an anthropologist. I like being with people. I like hearing what they have to say about their world and how they see the world. And I guess one of the things that I think is really important for an anthropologist is a high tolerance for ambiguity, inconsistency. I think as we don't stick very well to programmatic rules and norms, even if sometimes we think we do. And I like that about humanity, all of our wondrous capacity for ugliness and for beauty, and sometimes those two things exactly at the same time. I just really, I love that. I love inconsistency. I love these problems that don't necessarily have easy answers about human behavior, about science, and this, I think, this helps in terms of my relations with others. I'm fascinated by the way different people see the world, I guess.
Cool. Well, yeah, and I love that. I really appreciate that you're bringing your perspective as an anthropologist to this series, which is really the main target is for groundwater hydrologists and hydrogeologists. So I'd love to hear what you most want to share with the next generation of hydrogeologists or groundwater hydrologists.
I guess following on from that perspective, from me as an anthropologist, but also I guess my interest in how people think, is that there are profound thinkers everywhere. Just as there are people who are not inclined to think, and these, you know, and where you most don't expect there to be a profound thinker, and so I think it's about listening respectfully to what people have to say.
Yeah, totally. I guess that leads to another question of what kind of alternative form of knowledge, or if you want to get really academic about it, academic paper, has most impacted you in all of this work?
I was trying to think of one before.
Yeah.
I guess a really important one, I think, is a paper by Elizabeth Povinelli from a very long time ago, about people she worked with in Northern Australia and their understandings of the world, of the earth, as well as things in it and their relationships to it. It's a paper called Might Be Something, and it's about knowledge of landscape, but through people's labor and working with and in landscape. So it's about a kind of level of uncertainty of how the world may behave at any one moment and what we might find in it.
Yeah. No, that sounds fascinating. And I guess maybe one final question is quite personal, because a lot of what we're talking about here is about anti-racism and different ways of being. And I was just wondering if you're interested in sharing one personal experience with with racism or sexism that you find find value for our audience?
Yeah, I guess. So, I mean, as a middle class white woman in Australia, I hadn't experienced racism for my life, so I haven't been subject to this. But it struck me, the kind of banality of everyday racism became apparent when I started working with Aboriginal people in North Queensland and spending a lot of time with people in a small country town where the Indigenous people were 10% of the population. So that's quite high in Australia. But and when I was with friends, Aboriginal friends in local shops and so on, notice being served last, and just these small ways in which you would be watched. And this was a kind of realization, that kind of visceral realization of the banality of everyday racism in Australia. And it really alerted me to not just these kinds of theoretical understandings of inequality and racism, colonial violence that writing about and thinking about and so on, but really that kind of visceral everyday lived experience of that. Not that I was as subject to others, but just by association. And I'm lucky to have had a little bit of insight into that, I guess, because it makes that theoretical, I guess, more available to one's understanding, if you even just a moment like that, or small moments.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think with that, thank you overall, Sally. Nice to hear a little bit more about you and your work, and I look forward to seeing more of that through the research talk. So let's shift to that.
So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country from which I'm speaking to you today, and these are the Turrbal and Yagara people, the original owners of Meanjin, the current day city of Brisbane. And I pay my respects to traditional owners past and elders present, and recognise that the area of land from which I'm speaking at the university is situated on land that's always been a place of learning. I also want to acknowledge Likanantai Atacamenyo peoples, whose territory extends across the Atacama Desert in northern Chile, and whose friendship and collaboration has been central to my research over the past decade or more. So back in 2013, a Likanantai friend, Doña Inés, suggested we go to Turi. We went up together up a track that reaches north and east into the mountains beyond the cemetery from the village to a sandy ravine in which a huge algarrobo tree marked the presence of groundwater with its size, its age, and its very existence. It was the focus of our destination for the morning, and Inés had said, let's walk there, there's a tree. So returning through the ravine, Inés collected foliage from small shrubs like basil to give to her small flock of sheep in the corral in Peine. Inés's village, Peine, is an agricultural oasis on the southern end of the Atacama salt pan, the Salar, and it's a small patch of arable land in a canyon that's watered by two springs. Inside the canyon and the gardens, it's green, but all around the oasis, it's really dry, as you can see in these images. Inés and other Atacamenyo Likanantai people and their ancestors have lived here and relied on these waters since well before the beginning of irrigation technology around 1000 AD. So in the recent past, people walked their herds throughout the extensive territory, only sometimes living in Peine and using herding refuges and adjacent waters in the highland pasture in summer months and the lowland pasture on the edge of the salt pan in the winter. So this region of Chile is host, as they say, to almost half of the nation's mining industry, about 90% of which is copper mining. And I began speaking with people here in this area in 2009 to ask about their relationship with the Australian mining giant BHP, a company with the largest copper mine in the world called Escondida. From my first conversations, people in Peña expressed really deep concerns about mining company groundwater use. And I became more and more interested in water over time. The problem here is that the impact of the mining industry's water use has been underreported by these companies. It's been unregulated by the Chilean government, and it's been difficult to detect as well in just observations of the desert surface. And this problem intersects with political aspects of water rights and Indigenous rights. Water taken by miners is extracted from aquifers situated at lower altitude than the current location of subsistence agriculture and domestic water use by Indigenous people. And so the places where people live are the locations where their rights to land and water is protected by the government. But the places where miners extract is outside these areas. So this has enabled miners to continue extraction with very few hindrances. So as we know, a generalized, even global problem of groundwater is invisibility. The fact that technology necessarily mediates our human vision of the underground. So groundwater, perhaps like climate change, might be considered something that's visualizable, but not immediately available to the senses. Seeing water is the phrase I refer to Indigenous Licanantai Atacamenio people's refusal to accept the official diagnoses by the state and by mining companies that groundwater extractive activities in their territory have had no impact. Some of what I mean by seeing is not about the problematics of the visual and the underground, but it refers to Licanantai people's insistence on what is an ontological concern with how the world on their terms can be understood to be, or how Indigenous people see the world and its relationships, both human and non-human. So I've been interested in studying the ways that social and ecological harms may be rendered unseeable exactly through the impact studies in the Atacama salt pan. So some of my research shows how impact assessment, state regulation, and company self-reporting each allow for potential information about harm from groundwater extraction to be ignored. Very briefly then, three angles I have in terms of seeing groundwater. One of these refers to how Licanantai people know water in their own territory, where waters are, what they do, how waters behave, and also what water might want, in the sense that water is both material and it wants to, for example, flow downhill. In the physical landscape, it appears in particular places, as well as the idea that water is a living entity, something that desires certain kind of treatment, including certain kinds of ritual. So the second kind of seeing water that I think about relates to Licanantai responses to what is left out of the mining industry's water extraction reports. The village of Peña that you see in this image, which is on the southern end of the Salar and within range of the impact of the global giants of copper mining, have had a really long experience of the mining industry. And leaders in this community are expert in articulating their interests in extractive politics and thinking about harm from water extraction by mining companies, even though this information is often denied to them. And the third kind of seeing water is about the ways in which ethnography, the research I do as a kind of collaborative knowledge generation, provides insights into the partiality of scientific and social scientific knowledge, and how this partiality is important for thinking about groundwater itself. So I'm going to tell you a really quick story about the importance of thinking about groundwater in terms of the dimensions of uncertainty. So in 2017, community leaders from PayNet asked me to work with them in response to mining impact reports, especially an environmental impact assessment, or EIA, submitted by Mineral Escondida. So this company had rights at around 1,400 litres per second in the Monturaqui area for a period of 22 years, starting in the 90s and expiring in 2019. And the company's volume of fresh groundwater extraction rights for copper processing in this area have been the highest since the mine began, highest of all the different mining companies in the area. But there's no independent scientific or regulatory knowledge of the area. And this has meant that the company were sort of publicly uncontested in declaring that their extraction activities are sustainable, have been sustainable. Their EIA, their impact assessment report in 2017 was basically a bid to extend their extraction rights for another 11 years in this area. So you have the aquifer referred to as Monturaqui, where the company extracts water. And this is connected to subterranean flows that trickle down towards the southern end of the Atacama salt pan, potentially nourishing a small wetland pasture called Tiloposo. Small, but very important. Over 20 years, the PayNet community, in whose territory Tiloposo is located, their disagreement with the company about the potential harm of its water extraction activity was largely muted, was largely kept between the community and the company itself. It wasn't a big public conflict. And partly this is because they could not access good information about the damage being done. But in 2017, the company's bid to continue water extraction met a really strong resistance from the community, but also other Indigenous communities in the whole of the Atacama salt pan area. And at the end of 2019, the company's extraction rights expired before they could resolve their EIA or the problems associated with it. So on the final day of their extraction permission, the company's water extraction permission, on December 31st, 2019, around 30 community members traveled to witness the company shutting down its pumps. But the EIA had to continue the process of, the process of the environmental impact assessment had to continue. And in January 2020, the legal team outlined their final analysis of this EIA process. It was a period of consultation that included legal analysis, hydrogeological analysis, social scientific analysis, and lots of community reporting about their knowledge and experience of the many years of water extraction. The legal team summarised this to a community meeting, this process of reporting, saying there are more doubts about the company's extractive activity and impacts than certainties. And they asserted that the government regulator who was present at the meeting had an obligation to prevent the company from continuing to extract water in the area, given there was no good scientific evidence regarding impacts, nor convincing company plans for mitigation of that impact. So by early February 2020, the company released a press statement saying it would cease all water extraction in the interest, it said, of sustainability. So in the southern Salar de Atacama, where I work, seeing water extraction volumes, or the negative environmental effects of extraction by the mining industry are both self-evident for Atacama Likarantai people, as well as somewhat invisible. They're self-evident by implication of the volumes of extraction, but impact is seldom immediate to the observer of the surface. And it's certainly difficult to get access to company data. So my research includes a hopeful narrative about how uncertainty can inspire possibly earlier action to regulate extraction and to support how communities see water in response to unknown environmental harms.
All right, thank you very much, Sally. There was a lot of great nuggets there. I really, yeah, the themes of seeing and unseeing and unseeable and the different forms of seeing, I appreciate all that. I think it will be really useful it was certainly useful for me and hopefully for others kind of in the groundwater community to think in those ways. And I actually see parallels with some things that are evolving in Canada here around Indigenous-led environmental impact assessments. So that's a whole kind of idea that's evolving and practice that's evolving in Canada. So thank you for being part of the Water Underground talks and bringing this to our community.
Thanks so much, Tom. I hope, I hope people find it useful, and my contacts are there. People are welcome to email me with questions and
Cool.
any.
Cool. Thank you.